On July 25, 2000, Air France Flight 4590 took off from Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. 11 seconds later, 'twas on fire. 113 people died that day. And 2 years after that, the most extraordinary passenger aircraft ever built was retired forever. Gone, never to fly again. But here's the thing. The crash didn't kill the Concorde. The Concorde was already dying. The crash just finished it off. And the real story of why this plane, this beautiful, impossibly fast, ahead of its time machine, never became what everyone thought it would be, is so much more complicated than one terrible day in the summer of 2000. Let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand why the Concorde failed, you have to understand what it actually was and what it meant to the people who built it. It's the 1950s. World War II is over. The world is rebuilding, and aviation is exploding. Commercial flight is becoming real for ordinary people for the first time. Airlines are expanding. Airports are being built, and engineers everywhere are asking the same question: how fast can we go? The Americans had already broken the sound barrier in 1947 with Chuck Yeager in a military jet, and the next logical question was obvious. If a military plane can fly faster than sound, why can't a passenger plane? The British and French governments decided they were going to answer that question together. They signed an agreement in 1962 to jointly develop a supersonic passenger aircraft, something that had never been done before, something that would change the world. They called it Concorde. And on paper, it was everything they promised. Concorde could fly at Mach 2, twice the speed of sound, about 1,350 miles per hour, while a regular passenger jet was cruising at around 550 miles per hour. Concorde was cutting through the sky at more than double that speed at 60,000 feet, so high you could actually see the curvature of the Earth from the windows. A flight from London to New York on a regular plane takes about 7 hours. On Concorde, it took 3.5. You could leave London in the morning, have a full day of meetings in New York, and be back in London the same evening. It was genuinely science fiction made real. The passengers who flew it described it as unlike anything else. The seats were narrow, but the experience was extraordinary. The food was exceptional. The service was impeccable. And the speed, the feeling of sitting in a metal tube moving faster than a bullet at the edge of the atmosphere, was something no other aircraft could offer. For the people who flew it, Concorde wasn't just a plane, it was a statement. It was proof of what human beings could build when they decided to push as far as they possibly could. So why did it fail? Why are there no supersonic passenger planes flying today? Why did something so extraordinary disappear so completely? The problem started before Concorde ever carried a single paying passenger. The first issue was the sonic boom. When any object travels faster than the speed of sound, it creates a sonic boom, a massive shockwave that radiates outward from the aircraft and hits the ground like a thunderclap. Not once during the flight. Continuously. The entire time the plane is flying at supersonic speed. Everything below it on the ground is hearing and feeling that boom rolling across them like a wave. Early test flights over land made this immediately obvious. People on the ground weren't just mildly annoyed, houses shook. Windows cracked, livestock panicked. Complaints flooded in from everywhere the plane flew over. The United States banned supersonic flight over land entirely in 1973. Not just for Concorde, for any supersonic aircraft, which meant Concorde could only fly supersonically over the ocean. It could never take a direct supersonic route from, say, London to Los Angeles or Paris to Chicago, because that path crosses land. It was locked into transatlantic routes, London to New York, Paris to New York. That was essentially it. That single limitation cut the potential market for Concorde from hundreds of routes down to a handful. Then came the fuel problem. Flying at twice the speed of sound doesn't just require more power than a regular jet. It requires an almost incomprehensible amount more. Concorde burned fuel at roughly 4 times the rate of a conventional aircraft for the same distance. 4 times. To fly the same transatlantic route that a 747 could fly on a certain amount of fuel, Concorde needed 4 times as much. In the early 1970s, right when Concorde was being developed and the first orders were coming in, something happened that changed everything. The 1973 oil crisis hit. Oil prices quadrupled almost overnight. Suddenly, the economics of running an aircraft that guzzled fuel at 4 times the normal rate looked completely different than they had just a year earlier. Airlines that had placed orders for Concorde started doing the math, and the math didn't work anymore. One by one, they started canceling. Pan Am canceled. TWA canceled. American Airlines canceled. Qantas canceled. By the time the cancellations stopped, only 2 airlines were left operating: Concorde, British Airways, and Air France. And both of them were only doing it with heavy government subsidies because their governments had built the plane and couldn't afford the embarrassment of it sitting on the ground. So Concorde became something nobody had planned for it to be. Not a revolutionary aircraft that would change how everyone flew, but a luxury product, a toy for the extremely wealthy. Tickets on Concorde cost roughly what a small car costs today. A round-trip transatlantic ticket was thousands of dollars at a time when a regular first-class ticket on a 747 was a fraction of that. The only people who could regularly afford to fly it were bankers, celebrities, royalty, and executives with company expense accounts. And for a while, that was enough to keep it going. British Airways actually turned a profit on Concorde for several years running. The wealthy passengers who flew it were loyal. Some of them flew it every single week. But the passenger base was tiny. There were only 14 Concorde aircraft ever built for commercial service. 7 operated by British Airways and 7 by Air France. Compare that to the hundreds of 747s flying around the world at the same time, and you start to understand just how small the Concorde operation really was. And then came July 25, 2000. Air France Flight 4590 was taking off from Paris when it ran over a small piece of metal on the runway. A titanium strip that had fallen off a different aircraft minutes earlier. That strip burst one of Concorde's tires. The shredded rubber flew upward at enormous speed and ruptured a fuel tank in the wing. The leaking fuel ignited, and Concorde lifted into the air already on fire, unable to gain speed or altitude, and crashed into a hotel near the airport less than 2 minutes after takeoff. 113 people died. 100 passengers, 9 crew, and 4 people on the ground. The entire Concorde fleet was grounded immediately. Both British Airways and Air France suspended all flights while investigators figured out what had happened and whether it could be prevented. They did eventually return to service in 2001 after modifications were made: reinforced fuel tanks, Kevlar lining to protect against tire debris, improved tires. The plane was technically safe to fly again. But the passengers didn't come back. The crash had shaken the confidence of even Concorde's most loyal flyers. Bookings were a fraction of what they had been before. And now the airlines were being asked to invest heavily in modifications for an aircraft that was already 30 years old. Running on technology designed in the 1960s, burning fuel at a rate that made less economic sense every year, and serving a market that had never grown beyond a tiny sliver of the wealthiest travelers in the world. In April 2003, Air France announced it was retiring its Concorde fleet. British Airways followed shortly after. And on November 26, 2003, the last commercial Concorde flight landed at London Heathrow. The dream was over. Here's what makes this story stay with me. Concorde wasn't a failure of engineering. The people who built it achieved something genuinely extraordinary. They took humans to the edge of space and got them across the Atlantic in the time it takes to watch 2 movies. The engineering was brilliant. The craftsmanship was exceptional. Even today, decades later, no commercial passenger aircraft has matched what Concorde could do. It was a failure of economics, of politics, of timing, of a world that wasn't quite ready to pay what supersonic travel actually costs. But that story isn't over. Right now, there are multiple companies actively developing the next generation of supersonic passenger aircraft. Boom, Supersonic, Airline, Spike Aerospace. They're all working on planes that can fly at Mach 1.7 or faster, quieter than Concorde, more fuel efficient, and at a price point that could reach more than just the ultra-wealthy. Whether they succeed where Concorde couldn't, that's the real question. And when you're sitting on a 7-hour flight to New York, staring at the seat back in front of you, thinking about how this exact same journey used to take 3.5 hours, maybe you'll find yourself hoping they do. And that is why Concorde never became popular. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the big dreams, the disasters, the questions hiding behind the things we take for granted every day, then you're in the right place. Drop your why question in the comments. The best ones are going on the list. Like the video if you learned something, subscribe if you want more. And I'll see you in the next one.